Hello class, welcome to week 3. This week we'll be looking at spirit and nature in Protestant theology, in contemporary re-envisionings of the role and status of the cosmic Christ in Catholicism, and in Eastern Orthodox Christianity, specifically from the lens of a Greek Orthodox village. John B. Cobb Jr. is a prominent Protestant theologian and one of the founders of contemporary process theology. He begins his article somewhat problematically, in my view, by pointing out that all the so-called higher religions are anthropocentric. That is to say, they are religions of human salvation, and they have focused on the salvation of individuals. The charge of anthropocentrism is thus owned in being somewhat parsed. Salvation is more important than this physical natural world. For some, this may have a ring of truth. It's definitely a deeply Protestant understanding of the meaning and function of religion, i.e. to focus so exclusively on salvation. Why? Because Protestant Christianity is particularly focused on the question of human salvation. In Luther's terms, the theology of the cross being more important than the theology of glory. So let's explore and explain this a little more by getting into Cobb's article on Protestantism and ecology. Remember this guy from week 2? The term Protestantism, you will recall, derives from to protest, that is, express strong objections to, and to reform, to improve by correcting errors. Thus we speak of the Protestant Reformation. What was it all about? Well, in the first instance, Luther aimed to reform specific church practices like selling indulgences. But he also wanted to reform the foundation of the Christian faith and to redefine Christian theology. Remember, reason is a whore that cannot be trusted to lead to God? Traditional theology for Luther is corrupted by reason. The theological revolution that Luther begins has as its core an attempt to refound theology on human salvation, or soteriology. In the words of contemporary scholar Gilles Fraser, theology is not about abstract questions of God's existence or nature. It must have nothing to do with scholastic debates over the nature of the prime substance, of what it means to call God the prime mover, of the nature of the soul as form, etc., still less how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Theology is about human salvation. According to Luther, all existing theology so far in the Catholic Church has been a theologia gloriosus, the man who looks upon the invisible things of God as they are perceived in created things does not deserve to be called a theologian. However, the man who perceives the visible rearward parts of God as seen in suffering and the cross does. This is tantamount to a purification of Christian theology from its Neoplatonic elements, rooted in the Greek tradition of philosophical wonder. Only by rooting theology in suffering and salvation, that is Christ on the cross, and his gift to all humanity, do we attain to the true theology. Luther thus believes he owes it to the Lord to bark against philosophy, calling it a vain and ruinous study, and encouraging his followers to have nothing to do with it. Philosophy is an evil skill and should only be learned insofar as it's necessary in order to reject it. It is rather time to devote ourselves to other studies and to learn Jesus Christ and him crucified. Rethinking the question of Protestantism on human salvation or the theology of the cross, in our contemporary era, Cobb begins by acknowledging that Protestantism must be acknowledged to be a particularly anthropocentric religion, indeed an extreme case. Christianity as a whole has emphasized the interior relation of the individual to God, but the Eastern Church down to the present has kept in view the larger setting of God's relation to the whole of creation. Protestant reformers everywhere focused overwhelmingly on questions of individual human salvation, i.e. personal redemption. God and the soul are now center stage, not nature, the broader creation providing only background and context. Following Kant, probably the greatest of the Protestant philosophers, Protestant theologians have tended to abandon the world of nature to science and taken over history as their domain, usually emphasizing the moral and spiritual spheres and focusing attention on the individual person. Creed and practice are not always the same, however, and Cobb notes that many prominent Protestants in the 19th and 20th centuries continued to find God in and through nature. This is set up by Cobb as a contrast between popular Protestant piety and the Kantianism of more recent Protestant theology. And here we get a bit of a biographical story. During Cobb's student days, ministers learned in the course of their studies that attention to nature was sentimental and irrelevant. Cobb had some training in contemporary Protestant theologians that more emphasized nature and naturalism, but he was mainly engaged with Rudolf Buttmann's existentialist Christianity. His first book, A Christian Natural Theology, was an attempt to use Alfred North Whitehead's process philosophy of nature in order to reconceptualize Protestant theology, but his basic topics were still man and God, not nature. And here we get an important confession. I write this to indicate how deeply I was socialized into anthropocentrism by the dominant character of Protestant theology, even when the philosophical and theological sources on which I drew offered a very different option. Cobb's acknowledgement continuing, it was not until the end of the 60s when my eyes were opened to the seriousness of the environmental crisis that I became aware of this paradox. When I read Lynn White's famous essay, The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, I saw at once that he was correct, at least as far as the Christian traditions that had informed my thinking were concerned. Alas, it was Protestantism that provided the most important context for the rise of anthropocentric and individualistic philosophy, ethics, economics, and political thought. Whatever the failures of the other great religious traditions, it is our failure, that is, us Protestants, which bears the chief responsibility for the degradation of the planet. That's a pretty serious acknowledgement, but fortunately, for Christianity and Protestantism in particular, one of the most dynamic aspects of the Christian faith is its emphasis on repentance and forgiveness. Repentance always means changing direction and rethinking one's theology. For Cobb, it means focusing more on God's creation in Genesis, not as periphery to the Abrahamic or Christian covenants, but as central. And it also involves a new appreciation of Noah's covenant as containing deep wisdom concerning our dependency on nature. Once the conscience spectacles are removed, it is clear that within the Bible, the concern for the whole of nature and its interaction with human beings is persistent. What Cobb calls process theology can be understood from out of this emphasis on repentance, change, and transformation. Under the influence of the critical philosophy of Immanuel Kant, most professional Protestant theology has, according to Cobb's, fallen into the modern philosophic bias of defining issues epistemologically. Faith is one way or mode of knowing, and science is another. The question of how they are related is asked only subsequently. For the process theologian, however, epistemology, or our theories about what we know and how, always depends on ontological assumptions. The drift of Western philosophy since Plato is to start in epistemology and move towards ontology or metaphysics. However, in Western philosophy until Kant, meditations about the nature and the limits of knowledge were always conducted in light of certain presuppositions about what is real and what we can know. Since Kant, the mainstream of Western thought has been more comfortable with an epistemological focus, starting from the human subject, its capacities for knowledge, and only then reconnecting the world of knowledge with that of true reality or external nature. According to Cobb's, this epistemological focus in modern philosophy only deepens our anthropocentrism, and anthropocentrism can only be overcome when we reconnect our metaphysical assumptions or faith with the type of science that makes sense of them. In the case of Protestant theology in particular, however, fundamental assumptions brought in from the get-go may need to themselves be reformed. For example, to whatever extent a concern for creation as a whole is found in the Bible, in principle, Protestants must repent of their neglect of this concern. Process theology can thus be understood as the most progressive or open-minded wing of the Protestant tradition. For the process theologian, Christians should encounter wisdom everywhere, regardless of its source, even assimilating the teachings of the natural sciences and modifying their doctrine accordingly. On the whole, Protestant educational institutions have done this. There are always new challenges. For example, recognizing that most of the Bible is parsed from a masculine point of view. According to Cobb, to limit ourselves to the biblical texts and what tradition has drawn from them is not truly faithful to the open message of the Bible. So Cobb's next question is how process theology relates to deep ecology. He notes from the beginning that deep ecology has the potential to upset Protestantism's anthropocentric starting points. He thus distinguishes shallow ecology, when particular practical ecological problems are understood in terms of inherited anthropocentric categories, from deep ecology. That is, when thinking about our place in nature deeply reforms our intellectual, cultural, and religious heritage from within. On this note, Cobbs underlines 5 deep ecological tendencies in process theology. 1. The questions of deep ecology are inseparable from questions of justice and liberation from suffering and oppression. This is to say, the well-being of humans does not come after the well-being of nature, but is simultaneous with the well-being of nature. Note, a limited anthropocentrism remains in this formulation. Nature does not come first, and social justice among human beings is essential to the well-being of nature in simultaneity with the well-being of the human community. Thus, too, process theologians emphasize human beings as playing a distinctive role within creation. And here we find a criticism of deep ecology, which critiques speciesism and fails to recognize or minimize the special responsibility that human beings have within the whole of creation. According to Cobb, dominion of nature by human beings is not going to go away by denying its existence. We have to take responsibility for our position as shepherds or stewards of the earth as a whole. Third, how do process theologians and deep ecologists align or differ in regards to the sacredness of nature? Process theology agrees that nature is sacred and should be treated as such, but argues it is wrong to draw a line between the human and the natural that is supposed to also separate the sacred from the profane. The line between the sacred and the profane is not drawn between human beings and God's creation, but rather between God and all his creatures. The upshot here is that only God can really be said to be sacred. What makes nature or God's creatures sacred is God's Spirit present in all of them. Process theologians can thus agree that the earth is sacred, but the right way to speak of this sacredness is as incarnational, immanental, or sacramental. That is, in terms of God's presentness in the world in every creature. No creature is divine, but every creature has an intrinsic value. The effect of this is to relativize all attributions of the sacred to God, rather than to human disagreements over relative value. What about the views of various indigenous societies that particular places, trees, or animals are sacred? Well, I suppose the process theologian could retort that even here what makes a particular animal more sacred is its immanental status with respect to Great Spirit or God, but this does seem to be stretching things a bit. The fourth tendency is deep ecology's oversimplistic rejection of anthropocentrism and any gradations of value in the hierarchy of nature. For many deep ecologists, everything in nature is of equal value, equally important and necessary for the harmonious functioning of the whole. This is a tough pill for process theologians to swallow, for they continue to affirm gradations of value, according to which all creatures have intrinsic value, but some have greater intrinsic value than others. Process theologians should learn to affirm not just their practical interdependence with other beings in nature, but their ontological interdependence, this being a prerequisite for accepting responsibility over other creatures in a stewardship relationship. Lastly, process theology and deep ecology overlap and differ on the issue of animal welfare. According to Cobb, neither process theology nor deep ecology has been concerned enough with reducing individual animal suffering. I find Cobb's point here to be poorly formulated in comparison to the others. Surely deep ecologists don't simply focus on animals in the wilderness as an intrinsic good, but are above all concerned with needless animal suffering in our factory farms. It is the domestication of animals that is the true cause of the vast amounts of unnecessary suffering inflicted on our helpless fellow creatures. And this is indeed a deep ecological issue. I simply don't see the either-or in terms of a choice between preserving a viable biosphere and reducing the suffering of domesticated animals. But these issues are one and the same. Cobb concludes his article with 4 points on the nature of God's creation in process theology, and 3 recommendations about where we should go with the problem of anthropocentrism from here. 1. God cares for all creatures, not just for human beings, and human beings should follow in that universal care. 2. The value of other creatures is not limited to their value for us, and human values should sometimes be sacrificed for the sake of other values. 3. Reality is what it is in itself, and not restricted to how it is experienced by human beings. 4. Individual human beings and even humanity as a whole are not self-contained. Destruction and loss anywhere in the chain of creation diminishes me. We can see how these four correctives on the nature of God's creation in Protestant theology imply rethinkings of several inbuilt assumptions and anthropocentrisms. However, for Cobb, many elements of the anthropocentric perspective of Christianity and Protestantism in particular should be retained. As one, in all probability, individual human beings are the greatest embodiments of intrinsic value on the earth. 2, humans have a responsibility for other creatures in a way that is shared by no other species. 3, in order to exercise our responsibility well, we must make judgments of relative value about other creatures. In doing so, we must be open to learning from experience and mistakes. So much for Cobb's situating of Protestant and process theology within contemporary deep ecological debates. The second article we'll be looking at this week is titled The Scope of the Body, the Cosmic Christ, and is by Sally McFaig. McFaig is a powerful contemporary voice in ecological Christianity, to say the least. You may remember her interviews in Moyer's Spirit and Nature documentary. Here we'll be covering one of her classic pieces and just the intro to one of her latest works, published shortly before she passed in 2019. It's probably fair to say that McFaig has devoted her career to a Catholic re-envisioning of the Arian controversy, which we learned about last week, and the strong claim that re-understanding the historical incarnation of God as Jesus of Nazareth should not exclude our understanding of the whole of nature as an incarnation of the body of God. Nature becoming essentially Christian, the body of God, nature is Christi, or we might say Christic in essence. And nature, like God and Christ, are thus essentially loving and compassionate, especially for the vulnerable and excluded. According to the Christi paradigm, the liberating, inclusive love of God for all is alive in and through the entire cosmos. According to McFaig, Jesus' paradigmatic ministry actively fought for the inclusion of excluded bodies. The excluded and the outcast bodies for which we fought belong in and are comforted by the cosmic Christ, the body of God in the Christi paradigm. For McFaig, salvation is the direction of creation, and creation is the place of salvation. Neither can be thought without the other. The cosmos is ineluctably moving towards salvation, and this salvation is taking place in creation. This understanding should cause us to rethink our notions of place and space. That is, to speak with Northcott, for Christianity to develop a genuine doctrine of sacred place. For McFaig, the ecological sensibility demands that we broaden the circle of salvation to include the whole of the natural world. Those in the Christian tradition who have become accustomed to thinking of reality in the temporal or historical model, beginning in creation, the middle, the incarnation, ministry and death of Jesus, and the end, the eschaton, when God shall bring about the fulfillment of all things, should learn to modify their thinking in a spatial direction. McFaig next distinguishes her view of cosmic faith and place from natural theology. Natural theology tends to begin with creation and tries to make the claim that evolutionary history contains a teleological dimension, an optimistic arrow. For McFaig, however, cosmic faith in salvation is not the end result of an evolutionary process, but has been built into creation since the beginning. If we think the entire 15 billion year history of the universe and the billions of galaxies from a Christi perspective as diverse emanations of a singular cosmic Christ, then we learn to remythologize the Christian faith as genuinely cosmic and God's plan for creation since the beginning. Cosmic faith thus has a revisionist relationship to tradition, according to McFaig. Christian thought, creation is often seen as merely the backdrop of salvation and of lesser importance than redemption, visible in such comments as creation is the prologue to history, or creation provides the background and setting for the vocation of God's people. McFaig notes that in this way of viewing the relation between creation and redemption, creation plays no critical role. It is only the stage on which the action takes place. But in our model of the body of God as shaped by the Christi paradigm, creation is of central importance. The world in our model is the sacrament of God. One of the radical upshoots here is that Jesus' paradigmatic ministry is not limited to the years 1 to 30 CE, nor to the Church, but is available to all of us directly through nature. Christ is available everywhere. It is unlimited, with one qualification: it is mediated through bodies. For God is present not only in Logos or the sacraments, but in each and every being in creation. This sentiment is often more richly preserved in other faith traditions than Christianity, such as Goddess, native, and Buddhist ones, but it is also the core of a very ancient Christian sacramentalism. For McFay, God is not limited to particular times and places, but is coextensive with reality itself. Paul, John, Irenaeus, Augustine, the medieval mystics, Gerald Manley Hopkins, and Teilhard de Chardin all participate in this Christian sacramental tradition. All emphasize that we ought to love the things of this world principally as expressions of divine beauty, sustenance, truth, and glory. Note here the emphasis in McFaig on the theology of glory aspects. Very different than in the Cobb reading we just had on the theology of the cross. McFaig laments that unfortunately traditional sacramentalism is not a central concern for many Christians. But it should be, in the words of the poet Hopkins, Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs, lovely in eyes not his. This is a bracingly cosmopolitan formulation of the essence of Christianity, and one that would surely not be wholly acceptable to many forms of contemporary orthodoxy. McFay goes on to speak about two qualifications of the Christian sacramental relation to nature, and three phases of learning and transformation that we must undergo to fully realize it. According to the Christian sacramental perspective, all things have intrinsic value, and we need to replace the utilitarian attitude towards other beings that accompanies anthropocentrism with a perspective that values them intrinsically. Note how this goes further than Cobb's position regarding the relative necessity of judgments of higher and lower value, and is more in line with what Cobb's critiques as a tendency towards equality and universalism characteristic of deep ecology. For McFaig, the Christian sacramentalist should also focus on positive sacramentalism rather than negative. Negative sacramentalism focuses on bodies not as expressions of divinity, but as signs of human sin and destruction. This is the ascetic tendency in sacramentalism, which views the sacrament as a way of overcoming or purifying the human body and soul. For McFaig, an emphasis on positive sacramentalism implies that we should focus not on the use of all earthly bodies, but on our care for them. And this because the whole cosmos is God's concern, not just its human inhabitants, and not merely as our habitat. The three phases of our deepening understanding of sacramental nature include 1. A deconstructive phase, 2. A reconstructive phase, and 3. When we learn to approach sacramental nature prospectively, which is to say holistically, giving thought and care to the inclusion of all manifest creation, especially in regards to the way we eat. McFay's emphasis on the cosmic Christ as the essence of nature also has a strong social justice dimension. Just as in the overturning of oppressive and dualistic hierarchies, poor people are liberated from their enslavement by the rich, people of color are liberated from discrimination by whites, so also the earth and its many non-human creatures will be liberated from oppression and destruction by human beings. The destructive phase is further explained as a breaking down of our natural biases against nature, our prejudice that it is, at best, only useful for our needs, and our rationalizations in regards to activities that profit us but destroy it. The healing phase she further explains as especially appropriate to non-human dimensions of creation, the pollution of air and water, the greenhouse effect, the depletion of the ozone layer, the desertification of arable land, the destruction of the rainforests, are all signs of the poor health of the earth. In the healing phase, salvation includes as a bottom line the health of all bodies, especially the health of nature. The inclusive phase is further epitomized in Jesus' eating practices. As with the healing stories, the stories of Jesus feeding the multitudes and inviting the excluded to his table are scandals. Neither conventional standards nor natural selection operates on the themes of sharing and inclusion. Nearing her conclusion, McFaig now turns to the Christian sacrament of the Eucharist as a foretaste of a reunion with God and an eschatological banquet. McFaig, we have only two choices really: learn to experience all of nature sacramentally, or to continue to perpetuate the plague. All I maintain is that on this earth there are pestilences and there are victims, and it's up to us, so far as possible, not to join forces with the pestilences. Too often, Christians have joined forces with the pestilences, further entrenching the model according to which salvation through the cross is more important than the glorification of all creation. We do not overcome suffering by idolizing it, just as we do not overcome pestilence by focusing on otherworldly hopes. McFaig thus concludes with her re-understanding of the event of the resurrection as a festival. For her, belief in the resurrection is belief in the hope that diminishment and death are not the last word, but in some inexplicable manner the way to new life that, moreover, is physical. Embodiment is the essential prerequisite of all spirituality. McFaig thus speaks of embodiment theology. In his death, all creation dies. In his resurrection, all rises to new life. Believing in the body as spirit demonstrates our belief in the basic trustworthiness at the heart of existence, that life, not death, gets the last word, and that against all evidence to the contrary, and most evidence indeed being to the contrary, all our efforts on behalf of the well-being of our planet, and especially its most vulnerable creatures, will not be defeated. In this re-envisioning of Christianity, Christ is the firstborn of the new creation, to be followed by all the rest of creation, including the last and the least. In more recent developments in the field of religious studies and deep ecology, we find the emerging field of theology and climate change. Northcott, who we studied last week, wrote a book on this. It's a bit too scholarly to include in our class. The Introduction to the Universal Christ and Climate Change by Sally McFaig more does the trick. She begins with a quote from early phenomenologist turned Franciscan nun Simone Weil, who says that human beings are naturally cannibalistic. They eat instead of looking, they devour rather than paying attention, they consume other people and the planet in their search for fulfillment. Note, Simone Weil on spirit and nature would be a fantastic presentation topic for those who want to explore. She's a real marvel. From the 21st century ecological perspective, sin has become refusing to share, refusing to live in such a way that others, other people and other life forms can also live and live well. What is more, this is not a new understanding of sin, but rather is built on the traditional view that sin is being curved in upon oneself, that is the Ouroboros, rather than being open to God. What the threat of fascism and Nazism was to mid-20th century Europe, climate change is to us. Climate change is something very new in our new era of human existence, sometimes called the Anthropocene. Incarnational Christianity believes in an incarnate God, a universal Christ who loves and inhabits the world and is radically mundane. This has to do with how we live on a daily basis, the food we eat, the transportation we use, the size of the house we live in, the consumer goods we buy, the luxuries we allow ourselves, the amount of long-distance air travel we permit ourselves, and so on. All become issues not only of climate change, but of incarnational Christianity in the era of the Anthropocene. Why does nature appear so often as a realm in which God's presence is only residual? The philosophical explanation for McFaig is the truth of kenotic Christianity. Many world religions privilege some form of self-emptying of the divine into the world, the Greek concept of kenosis. In the Christian tradition, kenosis or self-emptying is seen as constitutive of God's being in creation. God empties himself into the world and into the cross. The world is so vast, however, and the cross is so specific that we often fail to notice the presence of God everywhere. In creation, God limits the divine self, pulling in, so to speak, to allow space for others to exist. For Paul, God emptied the divine self, taking the form of a slave, and Christian discipleship is this cruciform life, imitating the self-giving of God and Christ to others. Kenosis, or the self-emptying of the divine in the world, leaving residues and traces, can also be understood in terms of the process of decreation and sacred poverty. Could it be that the universal cosmic Christ can lead Christians to respond to climate change by living in a self-emptying way? We must recognize above all that life's flourishing on earth demands certain limitations and sacrifices at the level of our physical and emotional experience. Recognizing decreation and practicing sacred poverty are two core virtues of the incarnational Christian in the era of climate change. One might be tempted to think that the ecological strands of Christianity we've been studying so far aren't mainstream. Well, think again. Not only the Global Council, but the Pope of Rome, Pope Francis, sometimes called the Green Pope, has advocated and published extensively on the reinvestment of ecological Christianity. It doesn't get any more mainstream than that. Francis, go and repair my house, which as you see is falling into ruin. This is very much what our current Pope Francis considers his mission to be. Coretha Dam rightly underlines that Laudato Si is a rarely scholarly ecumenical work with rich and varied sources, comprehensive and wide-ranging textual analysis on a sweeping range of issues. It is also the longest of the encyclicals or papal publications so far. I hope you decide to read it one day. The last reading we're looking at this week is from a book titled Cosmos, Life and Liturgy in a Greek Orthodox Village by Juliette de Boulay. For how Northcott covered some global Christianities beyond the Western variety, he spoke a little bit about Celtic Christianity and Orthodox Christianity, but not so much. In almost all the readings we've studied so far, Eastern Orthodox Christianity is gestured to as a tradition that never really lost touch with the sacred in nature. Accordingly, it would be remiss if we didn't cover at least this traditional leader for eco-Christianity in some detail, and that's the purpose of our last reading. This is a more scholarly and anthropological text, but one about the life of Orthodox villagers. It's deeply beautiful and haunting. Another reason I couldn't resist including it is that the first two chapters of this book are titled The World and the Earth, and so they perfectly map onto our course title of Spirit and Nature. As this text is longer, I won't go into it in detail to keep this short. However, there are a few things I'd like to underline. The text from which these chapters are taken is actually the second book of du Boulay on the same subject, the 1974 book Portrait of a Greek Mountain Village, becoming an instant classic. Theory is great, but we should see how religion and conceptions of spirit and nature play out in the vitality, contradictoriness, humor, realism, and courage of village life. The basic existential phenomena of human existence and the archetypes which pattern our spirituality are more clearly revealed in these non-theoretical life worlds. They thus first looks to the folk metaphysics in Orthodox village life, according to which 1. God holds and contains evil, and evil is spiritual and worldly. 2. Nature, like God, is essentially creative and beneficent. And 3. Christ and the devil are locked in a cosmic dance between centricity and eccentricity, contingency and necessity, chaos and harmony, feast and fast, sanctuaries, angels, lairs of the demons, the hobgoblins and the underground, and the angels from above the sky. It sounds a little scary, but sometimes I just wish we moderns could live more in a folk epistemology like this. For Boulay, some of the most interesting and refined, subtle metaphysical speculations we find in folk notions in the Greek village include things like the sky is inexpressibly holy, it's for God alone, the rhythms and hollows of the earth are always set within the measure of sky, physical and spiritual cosmoi undergo contradiction and reconciliation according to our movements of piety or religious devotion and impiety. The dead are still living both under the earth before the ascension and in heaven after the ascension. Lower, middle, and upper worlds of the cosmic tree, or the vertical axes of our spirituality, are all connected to the horizontal, that is, through the way light and spirit, day and night, human existence and the land play out each and every day in physical space. Importantly, Christian, Jewish, and Hellenistic metaphors and elemental images are all in play in the Orthodox village imagination. Images such as ladders, wells, mountaintops, cradles, solar and lunar journeys, the three faiths, and many more. Seasonal climactic transformations are thought to unfold the drama of God's hierophany or revelation, and transcendence and immanence are fundamentally dynamic activities embedded in everyday practices. You may have noticed a pattern by now of me ending lectures by going back to Heidegger. In this case, Boulay's chapter can again be fruitfully compared to Heidegger's philosophy of dwelling in the fourfold. To be sure, village life has its superstitious elements, but nevertheless, in its essential outline, it sounds a fair bit like what Heidegger understands as human dwelling, always torn between the polarities of earth and world, mortality and divinity. As we'll see later when we study Bruce Folt's on the noetics of nature in Byzantine Christianity, Heidegger's position on spirit and nature is probably closer religiously to the Greek Orthodox position than the Western Christian one. Heidegger, in my opinion, might have liked this book. Especially relevant for Boulay's analysis, Heidegger presents in the 1930s and 40s an idea of the earth as a realm of self-sheltering, concealing, and of the world as a revealing and an opening. This is more or less exactly how Boulay's villagers encounter world and earth. There is so much to study and explore and admire in Boulet's 2 chapters, and also to puzzle over. But I'll let the intrepid among you do that for yourselves this week and end this lecture with a little bit of a story. I got interested in Greek Orthodox Christianity during a 2019 trip to contemporary Greece. I'd visited Greece many times growing up from the ages around 9 to 18, but hadn't been back since then, specializing in classical Greek mythology and religion, probably because I was so enamored of the Greek islands growing up. I was ready now to return to Greece and explore some of the sacred archaeological sites, which had so informed my readings of the history of philosophy and religion. Above all, I knew, like my father before me, that I had to go and see Epidaurus, a magnificent site and formerly a healing sanctuary in the ancient Greek religious world. Nowadays, when you travel to places like ancient Greece and you want informed local guides, you can go through the official channels. However, the official guides tend to charge quite a lot and to be standardized in their instructional curriculum. Greece being a fairly economically depressed region, even positions as certified tour guides require enormous amounts of training and are hard to come by. Accordingly, in the internet age, and really just in the last 5 years or so, travel websites like Airbnb have become a hub where uncertified but highly qualified guides can offer alternative adventure tours. I found a wonderful guide to take us around Athens and to drive north to the sanctuary at Delphi. When I went to Epidaurus, I found an equally excellent guide who taught me more than I can really possibly fathom or remember. His name was Heracles, and there you see him at the beginning of our tour. Rather than just take us directly into the sanctuary at Epidaurus and tell us about all the ruins, Heracles' plan, or Heracles, yes, the same as the Greek hero Hercules, was to take us on a nature walk in the lands around the sanctuary first, showing us the edible berries and plants and telling us about their spiritual and medicinal properties. In fact, Heracles was proud to be able to take us off a trail to one of the oldest gnarled olive trees in the region, thought by the local inhabitants to have been planted by the historical Hercules himself thousands of years ago. There you see a thunderbolt on Heracles' neon-colored t-shirt. Heracles was not your ordinary guide or your ordinary character, but was deeply committed to hortophagos, eating from the earth and vegetarianism, baking his own bread, learning the lore of indigenous plants, and following in the traditional ways of his Christian Orthodox ancestors, going on pilgrimage daily to various ever-open Orthodox sanctuaries in the region and lighting a candle, saying prayers in the correct way and knowing a great deal about the sacred texts of the Orthodox liturgy, such as the Philokalia. Accordingly, in sweltering 100+ degree Fahrenheit heat, as we ascended and climbed and got a little glimpse of the ancient ruins of Epidaurus, we thought, our real destination is right there. But in fact, we had come this way in order to visit an ancient Orthodox sanctuary on the road. Heracles had advertised his tour as a guide to the lands of Asclepius and Hugaia, to the sacred historical Epidaurus. But for him, the pagan deity of Hugaia, or health, and the pagan god of healing, Asclepius, son of Apollo, were not pagan deities to be superseded in his worship of Christ. Rather, were rich legacies which existed spiritually alongside his Christianity in perfect harmony. He knew the ages and dates of all the old paintings in the sanctuaries he brought us to. Where else in the world can you walk into what seems to be an abandoned sanctuary and find paintings which are over 1,200 years old, still richly textured into the life of the villagers who frequent these sacred sites every day, though usually only in solitude? Here's another less ornate sanctuary that he brought us to along the way. And here is the oldest, where we stopped for lunch. Heracles explained to us many things about Greek Orthodox spirituality and its harmony and continuity with Hellenistic spirituality that came before and was still present in the region. And for lunch, he brought out Greek salad he'd made at home with his wife and bread, all the vegetables being grown in his garden, and the sauce being an garlic sauce concoction that his wife invented and of which he was particularly fond. Heracles was such a warm and generous person. His tour truly an awe-inspiring experience. Due to my intimate knowledge of ancient Greek religion and mythology, we got along splendidly well, and I was invited to go and stay with him and his wife next time I'm in the region. Too bad COVID hit. In Northcott, we find a helpful summary of Juliette de Boulay that can help connect her vision of Greek Orthodox life to my experience and story of Heracles. Northcott writes, in the Greek village, the sense of place, a self-sufficient agrarian economy, are deeply rooted in the worship of the Holy Trinity. The Father Creator is the providential source of life in the field. Christ crucified and risen is the Redeemer of life from death, and this all points towards union with divine life, while the Divine Spirit is immanent in all living things and imbues daily work with a sacred significance. Central to the milieu and practices and meanings that de Boulay describes is Christianity understood as a form of symbolic materialism. I hadn't read these chapters of Northcott at the time, nor had I studied Boulay yet. They both make much of the distinction in Orthodox village life, the sacred versus the profane, in terms of two types of ritual bread, prospero bread and artos bread. Artos bread is the bread of everyday life. It is not unsacred and is often prepared with great care and stamped before being served with heritage insignias and symbols of the family and village clan. All bread is sacred, but beyond artos bread, prospero bread reflects participation in the Eucharist. For Catholic Christianity, we're used to thinking of the Eucharist as a thin wafer or cracker, usually produced by the Catholic wing of the bread industry, and definitely not the same bread we use at home to make a peanut butter sandwich. There is no such strict distinction in the eating of bread for the Greek Orthodox. Artos bread is the bread you eat every day at home, and yet it still has the symbolic significance of giving life, death, and resurrection through Jesus Christ. Prospero bread goes one step beyond this. It's the special loaf that you make and take to the church to share with the community and to receive blessing from the priest before being fit for Holy Communion. Prospero bread is stamped with a special seal, and reflecting the connection of the community or individual family with the church and with Christ. All bread bakers in the village community are responsible for bringing bread to church to be sanctified, broken, and circulated in the rituals of the Eucharist. Again, both prospero and artos bread are sacred. One is simply for communion and the other for everyday life, but both are blessed. Heracles himself had made much of this distinction between prospero and artos bread, saying that the bread that we were eating for lunch is artos bread, that I should come and spend more time with him and his family and show me more about the Greek Orthodox life. Everyone's on the internet these days, and Heracles, without being asked, several days after our tour, he sent me an email on Facebook, and I quote, "I send you photos from the secret seal of my wife's grandmother. It's very old, handmade. I am waiting for you to make with this seal prospero bread. Yours, Heracles." And that is actually a picture of the sacred seal of his grandmother used to make such bread. Clearly, traditions like this, both of the sacred and of sacred hospitality, exceed what we are used to in the Christian and post-Christian West. They remain in today's world as a reminder of a form of spirit in nature and of the sacred in place of heaven on earth, which we need very much but are in danger of losing. Just as the sanctuary at Epidaurus still stands as a reminder of the great healing powers of nature and the god Asclepius and Hugaya, so it is fitting that their underground guides today, findable through Airbnb, are at the same time teaching a way to recover a form of Christianity closely rooted not only in nature but in the deep past, and the only type of future for human beings that would be truly worth living. I hope you've enjoyed your 2 weeks studying the themes of spirit and nature and the history of Christianity in more detail, and I look forward to getting into similar material with you next week when we do the history of Judaism.